In 1971, in the small coal mining town of Stellarton, Nova Scotia, the most glamorous audio brand in Canadian history simply stopped existing. 10 years earlier, Clairtone had built the Project G, a $1,600 modernist stereo console that Frank Sinatra endorsed and Hugh Hefner placed in his penthouse. It was an engineering triumph of spherical speakers and solid-state power. But by the early 1970s, the Stellarton factory was silent. It left behind an empty 250,000 square foot plant and a staggering $25 million provincial government bailout. Hi-fi dealers lost a product they could proudly demonstrate. A workforce of hundreds lost their assembly lines. The Canadian living room lost a modernist icon, and surviving consoles were quietly liquidated. The paradox is that Clairtone did not collapse because nobody wanted their stereo. They collapsed because the cost of building a Canadian audio empire collided with a catastrophic political and manufacturing experiment. But the real story of Clairtone is not only the story of a failed factory, it is the story of a Canadian company that built the coolest stereo in the world and then forgot how to survive. Every week, we explore the forgotten Canadian speakers, amplifiers, and audio empires that once shaped how people listened to music and what happened when the market moved on. If you care about the history of sound, subscribe to the channel. The story of Clairtone begins not with nostalgia, but in a specific place, in a small Toronto apartment. In 1958, the Canadian living room had a specific architectural problem. The post-war economic boom had given thousands of families the disposable income to invest in a home entertainment system. They wanted hi-fi, short for high fidelity, meaning sound reproduction that tries to stay faithful to the original recording. But the physical objects required to produce that sound were visually aggressive. The standard audio format of the era was the console stereo, a large piece of furniture containing a record player, radio tuner, amplifier, and speakers all in one wooden cabinet. The problem was not the technology, the problem was the wood. The dominant American and European manufacturers of the late 1950s, names like Zenith, RCA, and Grundig, built audio equipment that looked like heavy, dark mahogany caskets. They featured fake French provincial styling, ornate plastic moldings, and thick grills that dominated a room. They were massive, immovable objects that clashed violently with the sleek, optimistic, mid-century modern aesthetic that was beginning to define new apartments in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Two young men in Toronto noticed this disconnect. Peter Monk was a Hungarian immigrant with an engineering degree from the University of Toronto. David Gilmore was an entrepreneur with a sharp, uncompromising eye for imported Scandinavian furniture and high-end retail. Together, they realized that the existing electronics industry fundamentally misunderstood what a stereo system was. The established audio brands treated the console as an engineering chassis covered in cheap wood. Monk and Gilmore believed it should be treated as high-end furniture that happened to produce exceptional sound. This was the Canadian absence. The domestic market did not lack music. It lacked a physical object that a modern, design-conscious listener actually wanted to look at. In late 1958, operating out of a small workspace, they formed a company. They called it Clairtone. Their strategy was entirely different from the traditional electronics manufacturers. Monk and Gilmore, did not initially attempt to reinvent the audio circuit. Instead, they focused on system integration and aesthetic perfection. They sourced high-quality, proven components from established European manufacturers, turntables from England, and chassis components from West Germany. A turntable, a rotating platform that plays vinyl records with a tone arm and cartridge, needed to be reliable. And an amplifier, an electronic device that increases a weak audio signal so it can drive speakers, needed to be clean. But the true innovation was the cabinet. Clairtone abandoned the dark, heavy mahogany and the fake historical styling. Instead, they used clean-lined, oiled walnut and teak. They employed local Canadian woodworkers and cabinet makers to craft long, low, minimalist enclosures that looked like they belonged in a Danish design magazine. The speakers were hidden behind subtle, elegant grille cloth, seamlessly integrated into the furniture. The first Clairtone stereos were stunning to look at, but that beauty created an immediate, systemic problem. The traditional audio retail network did not know what to do with them. In the late 1950s, Canadian audio was sold through local radio shops, appliance stores, and dedicated stereo dealers who cared deeply about technical specifications and very little about interior design. When Monk and Gilmore took their sleek, minimalist consoles to these traditional dealers, the response was hesitant. The Clairtone units were expensive. They did not look like the stereos the public was used to buying. A local appliance dealer in suburban Ontario was not the right environment to sell a piece of modernist luxury. To survive, Clairtone had to bypass the traditional audio dealer entirely. They needed a retail space where aesthetics and luxury were already the primary language. They took their first production run directly to Eaton's College Street store in downtown Toronto. At the time, Eaton's College Street was not just a department store. It was the absolute arbiter of upscale Canadian taste, featuring high-end furniture showrooms and curated interior design displays. The buyer at Eaton's was initially skeptical of an unknown Canadian electronics brand, but when the Clairtone console was placed on the floor, the reaction was immediate. It did not sit in the electronics department like a piece of machinery. It sat in the furniture department like a centerpiece. Customers walking through the showroom were drawn to the oiled teak and the low, modern profile. When the salesperson dropped the needle on a record, the rich, room-filling sound proved that the beautiful box was also a serious piece of hi-fi equipment. Eaton's ordered more. Then Simpson's, another major Canadian retail institution, placed their own orders. The early reception shattered the conventional wisdom of the North American audio industry. Monk and Gilmore had proven that listeners were willing to pay a premium price if the stereo elevated the design of their living room. By 1959, the demand was overwhelming. The small startup rapidly expanded, moving into a proper manufacturing facility in the Toronto suburb of Etobicoke. The factory floor was a unique blend of a traditional woodworking shop and an electronics assembly line. Skilled cabinet makers, craftsmen who understood how to match wood veneers and build rigid, resonance-free boxes, worked alongside technicians wiring the internal components. The scale of the operation grew at a staggering pace. Within a few years, Clairtone's sales rocketed past the $1 million mark. The brand became a status symbol in Canada. If you were a young, successful professional in a new Toronto high-rise or a modernist home in West Vancouver, a Clairtone stereo in the living room signaled that you had arrived. You were not clinging to the heavy, dark furniture of the past. You were living in the sleek, optimistic future. The company was no longer just assembling parts. They were dictating the aesthetic direction of the entire domestic audio market. Their dealer network expanded across the country, and their catalogs presented the stereo not as a technical instrument, but as the heartbeat of the modern home. Clairton had conquered the Canadian living room by wrapping good sound in beautiful wood. But Monk and Gilmore were not satisfied with simply building a better wooden box. They looked at the long, rectangular console stereo and realized that no matter how minimalist the teak veneer was, it was still a box. To truly separate themselves from every other audio manufacturer on the continent, they had to reimagine the physical shape of sound itself. They had proven that a stereo could be beautiful. Now they were about to prove that a Canadian stereo could become a global icon. By 1963, Clairton had established a highly profitable rhythm. The company was producing thousands of beautifully veneered, low-profile stereo consoles, and the Canadian market was buying them as fast as the Etobicoke factory could assemble them. But Peter Monk and David Gilmore were restless. They recognized that while their teak and walnut cabinets were elegant, they were still fundamentally rectangular boxes. To completely separate Clairtone from the massive American electronics giants, they needed a flagship product that did not just look like good furniture. They needed an object that looked like the future. They initiated a secretive design program that would eventually be called the Project G. The mandate given to industrial designer Al Faux and the engineering team was to shatter the traditional visual language of hi-fi. They were not asked to build a cheaper stereo or a slightly louder stereo. They were asked to build a statement piece that would force the world to look at Canadian industrial design. When the Project G was finally unveiled in 1964, it did not look like a radio, a record player, or a piece of domestic cabinetry. It looked like a piece of modernist sculpture that had suddenly landed in the living room. The central cabinet was a sleek, perfectly finished expanse of Brazilian rosewood. It did not sit flush on the floor. Instead, it hovered in the air, supported by a minimalist, cantilevered base made of brushed aluminum. The wooden cabinet housed the amplifier, the radio tuner, and a high-end imported turntable, a rotating platform that plays vinyl records with a tone arm and cartridge. But the most radical departure from traditional audio design was the placement of the speakers. For decades, the audio industry had hidden speakers behind large, fabric-covered rectangles, cut into the front of the wooden cabinet. The Project G removed the speakers from the cabinet entirely. Mounted on the outside of the rosewood frame, cantilevered in the air, were two massive 18-inch black aluminum globes. These were the sound sources. By using a spherical speaker enclosure, a round, seamless cabinet that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air, Clairtone solved a genuine acoustic problem. Traditional square speaker boxes suffered from internal standing waves, where sound bounced back and forth between parallel walls, creating muddy, distorted bass. A sphere has no parallel walls. The sound waves generated inside the globe dissipated evenly, resulting in a cleaner, tighter audio response. Inside each black aluminum sphere, Clairtone engineers installed high-quality drivers and a precisely tuned crossover, an electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them. The globes were not fixed in place. They were mounted on pivoting aluminum collars. This allowed the listener to physically rotate the speakers up to 340 degrees to adjust the soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system. If a Canadian buyer placed the Project G in a narrow Toronto basement rec room, they could turn the globes inward for direct, focused listening. If they placed it in a sprawling, open-plan modernist home in West Vancouver, they could rotate the globes outward to bounce sound off the walls, creating a massive, immersive acoustic field. To power these spherical speakers without ruining the sleek lines of the rosewood cabinet, Clairtone had to abandon old technology. Traditional stereos used vacuum tubes, which generated massive amounts of heat and required tall cabinets with heavy ventilation grills. The Project G utilized a solid-state amplifier, an electronic device that uses smaller, cooler silicon transistors instead of glass vacuum tubes to increase a weak audio signal so it can drive speakers. By moving to solid-state architecture, the internal electronics ran cooler and took up significantly less physical space, allowing the rosewood cabinet to remain impossibly thin and elegant. The engineering was brilliant, the aesthetics were revolutionary, but the price was terrifying. When it launched, the Project G retailed for roughly $1,600 to $2,000 Canadian dollars. In 1964, that was not just expensive for a stereo, it was the price of a new Chevrolet automobile. It was an astronomical risk for a young Canadian company. The North American audio industry assumed the product would be a spectacular, expensive failure. They believed no consumer would pay the price of a car for a record player with strange black globes attached to the sides. They were wrong. The Project G gave Clairtone an untouchable Canadian audio moat. When the massive wooden crates containing the Project G arrived at Eaton's College Street in Toronto, they were not placed in the electronics aisle. They were displayed as high art. High-end design boutiques in Vancouver, luxury audio showrooms in Montreal, and elite furniture retailers across the country demanded floor models. The Project G commanded attention in a way that a standard Zenith or RCA console simply could not. It became the ultimate aspirational object. Passing a high-end stereo dealer and seeing the black aluminum globes glowing in the window became a defining cultural experience for audio enthusiasts in the mid-1960s. The Project G proved that Canadian engineering and design could compete at the absolute highest tier of the luxury market. It won silver medals at the Milan Triennale, one of the most prestigious design exhibitions in the world. It was featured in international magazines, proving that a high-fidelity system did not have to look like a coffin to sound magnificent. The risk had paid off entirely. The product had silenced the traditional critics and electrified the retail network. But that very success was about to trigger a chain reaction that the founders could not control. The Project G was an engineering triumph. It created a level of demand that the small Toronto workshops were never built to sustain. The success of the Project G fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Canadian audio industry. By 1965, Clairtone was no longer just a Toronto electronics manufacturer. They had become a cultural force. The small Etobicoke factory was running at absolute maximum capacity, pushing out thousands of standard teak consoles and scrambling to fulfill the back orders for their ultra-expensive futuristic flagship. The brand quickly transcended the traditional audiophile market and entered the realm of global celebrity. Frank Sinatra, the most powerful voice in the American entertainment industry, was introduced to the Project G. He did not just buy one for himself, he publicly endorsed it. Sinatra famously declared that he had never heard music sound better, an endorsement that sent shockwaves through the North American retail network. Hugh Hefner, the architect of the mid-century bachelor aesthetic, purchased a Project G for his Playboy mansion. Oscar Peterson, the legendary Canadian jazz pianist, whose recordings demanded absolute clarity and dynamic range, owned a Clairtone. Suddenly, the sleek rosewood cabinet and its floating black aluminum spheres were everywhere. When director Mike Nichols filmed the 1967 cinematic masterpiece The Graduate, a Clairtone stereo appeared in the background, cementing its status as the ultimate symbol of sophisticated modern living. This was not just a successful product launch, it was a Canadian cultural moment. In a high-end Montreal listening room, a dealer no longer had to convince a buyer that a domestic brand could compete with imported European luxury. In a Toronto showroom on Bloor Street, the Project G was displayed proudly in the front window, drawing crowds from the sidewalk. Even in smaller markets, passing by a music store and seeing the Project G became a retail event. The demand cascaded down the product line. Buyers who could not afford the staggering price tag of the Project G bought Clairtone's standard, rectangular teak and walnut consoles instead. They wanted a piece of the modernist dream. The company's sales figures exploded. They went from a small million-dollar startup to a publicly traded powerhouse, generating over $10 million in annual revenue. They expanded their dealer network across the United States, placing Canadian-built audio furniture in premium American department stores and boutique stereo shops. But this rapid, unprecedented scale created a dangerous new reality. The brand had become a symbol of Canadian modernity, meaning any failure would happen on a national stage. Every piece of wood, every aluminum globe, and every internal transistor had to be perfect to justify the luxury price tag. A stereo system at this level was not just a consumer good, it was a complex intersection of acoustic engineering and fine furniture making. The cabinet, the wooden structure that dictates both the aesthetic and the acoustic resonance of the system, had to remain rigid and visually flawless. The solid-state electronics had to remain perfectly reliable, because a breakdown in a Sinatra-endorsed flagship model would instantly destroy the brand's hard-won engineering credibility. The Etobicoke factory floor was pushed to its absolute limits. Skilled cabinet makers, men who had trained in traditional furniture guilds, were working overtime, matching grain patterns on Brazilian rosewood and oiling teak veneers. Electronic technicians were wiring chassis assemblies, carefully soldering connections on the amplifier boards as fast as the imported parts could arrive from West Germany and the United Kingdom. The existing Canadian supply chain was struggling to feed the massive retail machine that Monk and Gilmore had created. Clairton was riding a peak cultural wave. In a West Vancouver living room, a family could place a Clairton console against a glass wall overlooking the ocean, drop a vinyl record onto the English-made turntable, and listen as the amplifier pushed clean, distortion-free power into the room. It was the peak Canadian listening moment, a perfect alignment of sound, architecture, and domestic pride. The company had proved that Canada could design the future. But designing the future and manufacturing it at a massive scale were two entirely different disciplines. By 1966, Clairtone was the undisputed king of Canadian high-fidelity luxury. The company's stock, traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange, was soaring. Peter Monk and David Gilmour were celebrated as visionary industrialists. They were not just selling stereos. They were selling a fully realized vision of the modern Canadian lifestyle. The product line expanded rapidly to capture the momentum. Alongside the legendary Project G, they introduced the Project G2, featuring slightly smaller sound globes and a refined cabinet, and the Project T, a stunning rectangular console that maintained the strict, uncompromising modernist aesthetic. To understand the peak of Clairtone is to understand what happened in a Canadian living room when one of these machines was turned on. A listener would approach the long, low teak cabinet. They would lift the heavy, perfectly counterbalanced wooden lid. Inside, bathed in the soft glow of the receiver, an amplifier with a radio tuner and source controls built into the same unit, sat the turntable. When the stylus dropped into the groove of a vinyl record, the room did not just fill with sound, it filled with clean, effortless authority. Because the heavy wooden cabinet absorbed mechanical vibration, and because the spherical speakers eliminated internal standing waves, the bass was tight and the mid-range was spectacularly clear. The kick drum felt physical. The vocals felt present in the room. The listener was not fighting the room acoustics. The Clairtone was commanding the space. This acoustic and visual triumph triggered a massive expansion in the retail network. Clairtone catalogs from this era were not dry technical manuals. They were high-fashion magazines. They did not just list the frequency response, how evenly a speaker reproduces low, middle, and high sounds. They showed sophisticated people in minimalist homes relaxing next to the Project G. The message was clear. You were not buying a domestic appliance. You were buying a better, more modern version of your life. This marketing genius cemented the brand's dominance in high-end music stores and audio showrooms. In a Toronto hi-fi shop, a salesperson did not have to laboriously explain the circuitry. The stunning woodwork did the selling before the music even started. Clairton was no longer confined to Eaton's and Simpsons in Canada. The brand pushed aggressively into the United States, placing Canadian-built audio furniture on the floors of elite department stores like Macy's in New York, Marshall Field's in Chicago, and W&J Sloan in Beverly Hills. A high-end audio dealer in California was now proudly displaying a stereo designed in Toronto and built in Etobicoke. At its peak, the company was generating over $14 million in annual sales. They had captured a staggering percentage of the premium console market in North America. But this unprecedented volume created a dangerous paradox. Clairton was structured like a boutique luxury firm, but it was being forced to produce at the scale of a mass-market giant. Every single console required extensive manual labor. The cabinet, the wooden, plastic, or composite box, that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air, was still being finished by hand in Ontario. The internal electronics were still a complex logistical puzzle, requiring components to be shipped across the Atlantic, assembled in Toronto, and tested to ensure they met the strict hi-fi standards promised by the luxury price tag. The physical weight of the empire was becoming a liability. Shipping massive, heavy wooden consoles across the continent was punishingly expensive. If a flawless teak cabinet was scratched in transit to a Chicago dealer, the entire unit lost its luxury value and had to be returned. The cost of this domestic manufacturing system was immense. As wood, labor, and parts became more expensive in the bustling Toronto area, the profit margins on these beautiful machines began to shrink. The Etobicoke factory workers were exhausted. The assembly lines were choked with back orders. Monk and Gilmore realized that the Toronto plant was too small to handle the global demand, and the local labor market was becoming too expensive to sustain their rapid, aggressive growth. They needed a massive, modern facility. They needed a way to bring all the manufacturing, from the raw wood processing to the electronic assembly, under one giant roof. The company was at the absolute peak of its cultural power. A Clairtone stereo was the most desired object in the Canadian home. But beneath the polished rosewood and the brushed aluminum, the financial pressure of the audio supply chain was building rapidly. They had mastered the art of sound. They had mastered the art of design. They had built a dealer network that stretched from Montreal to Los Angeles. They had conquered the living room. But to conquer the balance sheet, the company made a decision that would ultimately destroy the brand. By 1966, the first crack in the Clairtone empire did not happen in a listening room. It happened on a loading dock. A high-end dealer in the United States quietly complained that a Project G order was delayed. Then, a prominent catalog dropped a smaller console line because the inventory was simply unavailable. In Etobicoke, Etobicoke, the factory floor was gridlocked. The company was drowning in its own unprecedented success. The physical reality of building massive, hand-finished wooden cabinets and sourcing delicate electronic components from across the Atlantic in the increasingly expensive Toronto suburbs had pushed the profit margins to the breaking point. The problem was fundamentally tied to domestic manufacturing costs. To build a Canadian stereo at this scale required vast amounts of space, raw materials, and skilled labor. As the company grew, Peter Monk and David Gilmore realized that the Toronto plant was no longer financially viable. They needed capital to expand. They needed a massive new facility. And they needed a cheaper labor force to protect their margins against the rising tide of global electronics manufacturing. They found their solution in a political entity called Industrial Estates Limited, or IEL. IEL was a crown corporation created by the provincial government of Nova Scotia. Its mandate was simple but desperate: to lure modern manufacturing away from central Canada to replace the dying coal and steel industries of the Maritimes. The government was willing to spend millions of taxpayer dollars to create jobs in economically depressed regions. The executives from Toronto and the politicians from Halifax negotiated a staggering deal. IEL offered Clairtone millions of dollars in subsidies, bond guarantees, and financing to build a state-of-the-art, 250,000 square foot mega factory in the small coal mining town of Stellarton, Nova Scotia. On paper, it looked like an industrial miracle. The company would suddenly possess the largest, most advanced electronics manufacturing plant in the country. The provincial government would get a glamorous, internationally recognized brand to revitalize Pictou County. But building a world-class hi-fi system is not like stamping out steel parts. When Clairtone moved the bulk of its production to Stellarton in the late 1960s, they effectively severed themselves from the established electronics and woodworking supply chains of Ontario and Quebec. The local workforce in Nova Scotia was proud, resilient, and incredibly hard-working. But they were transitioning from heavy industry and coal mining. They had zero institutional experience in assembling delicate solid-state receivers or finishing Brazilian rosewood to luxury furniture standards. A high-end amplifier requires precision. The new workers had to learn how to properly wire a transformer, an electrical part in some amplifiers that changes voltage and helps supply power, so that it did not introduce a hum into the audio signal. They had to learn how to mount heat sinks, metal fins or surfaces that help remove heat from electronic components, so the solid-state transistors would not overheat and fail. They had to assemble complex circuit boards and ensure that the delicate European turntable mechanisms were perfectly aligned inside the wooden cabinets. The learning curve was brutal, and the cost of failure was absolute. In a mass-market budget radio, a minor cosmetic flaw or a slight hiss is acceptable. In a luxury Clairtone console destined for a high-end Montreal listening room or a Beverly Hills showroom, a 95% success rate was an operational failure. If a cabinet arrived with a misaligned teak panel, the dealer could not sell it. If an amplifier exhibited a slight distortion because of a rushed solder joint on the Stellarton assembly line, the audio dealer simply returned the entire massive, heavy unit back to Nova Scotia. This created a devastating logistical nightmare. Shipping raw materials, heavy wood, aluminum globes, and electronic parts to rural Nova Scotia was expensive. Shipping the massive finished consoles back out to the major retail centers of Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles was even more expensive. The transportation costs alone began to eat alive the financial subsidies that the government had provided. The brand's untouchable engineering credibility began to erode. The sound that Sinatra had endorsed was now being threatened by quality control issues on a new, inexperienced factory floor. The executives in Toronto were geographically and culturally disconnected from the daily realities of the Stellarton plant. While the factory struggled with production, the Canadian listening room was secretly beginning to change. The era of the console stereo was reaching its natural end. A new generation of audiophiles was turning away from all-in-one furniture pieces. They wanted separate components, a standalone turntable, a dedicated receiver, and a pair of bookshelf speakers that they could mix and match. This technological shift meant that just as Clairtone was trying to perfect the mass production of giant wooden consoles in Nova Scotia, the global market was starting to view the console as an outdated concept. Japanese manufacturers were beginning to flood North America with smaller, cheaper, highly reliable separate components. Clairton was caught between a factory that could not build the old product efficiently and a market that was slowly moving toward a new way of listening. The factory was bleeding money. The board of directors, now heavily influenced by the provincial government that held the debt, grew anxious. The audio division desperately needed time to stabilize the Stellarton assembly lines and adapt to the shifting hi-fi landscape. But time is the one thing a heavily indebted, publicly traded company does not have. To satisfy the massive overhead of the 250,000 square foot facility and to pacify their government backers, Clairtone decided they needed a new, high-volume product. They looked away from the listening room, and they made a decision that would ultimately destroy the brand. In 1967, to keep the massive Stellarton assembly lines moving and to satisfy the intense political pressure from the provincial government, Clairtone made a fatal pivot. They decided to manufacture color televisions. It seemed to the financial managers like a logical expansion, but it was a catastrophic miscalculation of their own identity. Clairtone was an audio brand. Their entire reputation, their dealer network, and their consumer trust were built on acoustic engineering, modernist wood cabinetry, and a deep understanding of the Canadian hi-fi market. Television manufacturing was an entirely different discipline. It required different internal engineering, massive picture tubes, and a completely different retail strategy. The color televisions built in Nova Scotia were disastrously unreliable. The complex electronic chassis assemblies were prone to overheating. The company relied on imported picture tubes that frequently arrived defective. Components failed on the showroom floor before they were even sold. When a Toronto dealer sold a Clairtone stereo, they knew they were selling a premium, reliable piece of audio equipment that would last a decade. When that same dealer sold a Clairtone television, it often came back broken within weeks. This mechanical failure bled backward into the audio division. The warranty claims on the televisions drained the company's cash reserves, leaving absolutely no capital to research and develop new audio products. The brand's hard-won engineering credibility, the very trust that Frank Sinatra, Oscar Peterson, and the high-end retail network had validated, was suddenly destroyed by a flickering, unreliable television screen. While the company was consumed by the television crisis in rural Nova Scotia, the Canadian listening room was evolving without them. The late 1960s and early 1970s marked a brutal technological and cultural shift. The market was aggressively moving away from massive, all-in-one stereo consoles. A new generation of audiophiles and casual listeners alike wanted modularity. They wanted a separate receiver, an amplifier with a radio tuner, and source controls built into the same unit. They wanted a standalone turntable, and they wanted a pair of bookshelf speakers, compact speakers designed to rest on a stand or shelf, freeing up physical floor space in smaller apartments and basement rec rooms. Japanese electronics giants like Pioneer, Sansui, and Sony recognized this shift perfectly. They flooded the North American market with silver-faced receivers and reliable separate components that offered exceptional high-fidelity sound for a fraction of the cost of a Clairtone console. A younger buyer walking into a Montreal music store no longer wanted a massive teak coffin, no matter how beautifully it was veneered. They wanted the tactile experience of a stack of gleaming silver components. The Project G, once the absolute peak of modern design, began to look like a relic from a previous decade. The wooden console, as a product category, was dying. Clairton failed to adapt because they physically could not. They were entirely locked into the economics of the Stellarton megafactory, a facility that was designed specifically to mass-produce giant wooden furniture and now defective televisions. They could not quickly pivot to building small, nimble, separate stereo components because their entire supply chain, workforce, and financial structure were anchored to building giant wooden boxes. The strength of the massive factory had become a trap. The financial collapse was spectacular, public, and humiliating. The debt owed to the Nova Scotia government ballooned from millions to tens of millions of dollars. The political optics of a failing government-funded mega-project were disastrous. To stop the bleeding, the government forced the founders, Peter Monk and David Gilmour, out of their own company. Industrial Estates Limited, the government agency that had lured them to the Maritimes, seized total control of the operation. Politicians and bureaucrats, not audio engineers or visionary designers, were now running a high-end stereo company. The results were swift and predictable. The government managers did not understand the luxury audio market, nor did they understand the aesthetic language that made Clairtone valuable in the first place. Desperate to recover costs and keep the factory workers employed, they tried to build cheaper, mass-market products. They abandoned the expensive Brazilian rosewood, the carefully machined brushed aluminum, and the iconic spherical speakers. The new models rolling off the line felt cheap. The wood veneers were replaced with vinyl wraps. The precision audio components were swapped for budget alternatives. The sound quality plummeted. The prestige vanished entirely. High-end stereo dealers across Canada quietly stopped ordering the brand. A premium audio showroom in Vancouver could not justify dedicating floor space to a heavy, outdated console that no longer sounded exceptional. They moved the remaining Clairtone units to the back of the store, eventually replacing their front window displays with imported Japanese amplifiers and American bookshelf speakers. The brand had lost the room. The end came with cold, bureaucratic finality. By 1971, the provincial government realized the losses were unsustainable. The audio market had completely moved on. The television venture was a total failure. The brand name had lost all its former glory. The cash ran out. The government withdrew. The Stellarton plant closed. The machines were shut down. The workers went home. The parts were sold. The inventory was liquidated. The dealers moved on. The brand was dead. The factories were closed. The inventory was liquidated. And the name that once defined Canadian luxury was buried in debt. The death of the original Clairtone in 1971 was absolute and irreversible. Unlike other Canadian audio companies that survived by quietly moving production offshore, or brands that were successfully absorbed into larger global audiophile conglomerates, the Clairton stereo empire was simply dismantled. The Nova Scotia provincial government, desperate to recoup a fraction of their staggering financial losses, sold off the remaining factory inventory at fire sale prices. The brand name itself was later bought and slapped onto cheap, imported televisions and low-budget plastic cassette players, entirely erasing the luxury prestige that Peter Monk and David Gilmour had spent a decade building. But the physical objects they created in the early and mid-1960s refused to disappear. Today, a surviving Clairtone Project G is not viewed as a piece of obsolete consumer electronics. It is treated as museum-grade high art. In the Canadian vintage audio community and among international collectors of mid-century modern design, the Project G has achieved a mythical status. When one surfaces at a high-end estate sale or an international auction house, it does not sell for the price of a used stereo. It commands tens of thousands of dollars. On platforms like Canuck Audio Mart, enthusiastic collectors fiercely debate the intricacies of the original Etobicoke production runs versus the later models. The few dedicated audio technicians in Toronto and Montreal who still know how to restore the early solid-state amplifiers, an electronic device that increases a weak audio signal so it can drive speakers, are trusted with these machines as if they were restoring classic luxury automobiles. They spend months tracking down vintage West German turntable components and meticulously replacing dried-out capacitors on the original circuit boards just to keep the music playing. This obsessive preservation effort exists because the original Project G passes the ultimate test of legacy. It still proves something fundamental about the nature of sound and design. The collectors are not just chasing hollow nostalgia. They are chasing a specific, unrepeatable moment in Canadian engineering. The Project G still proves that a high-fidelity system did not have to be an ugly, imposing wooden coffin. The spherical speakers, a round, seamless aluminum cabinet that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air, still eliminate internal standing waves just as effectively today as they did in 1964. The sound remains remarkably clear, physical, and authoritative. It stands as a massive physical rebuke to the disposable plastic Bluetooth speakers, the thin-sounding soundbars, and the invisible streaming ecosystems of the modern era. It reminds listeners that reproducing music used to be an intentional, physical event that anchored the entire architecture of a room. The physical site that destroyed this ambition remains standing. The massive 250,000 square foot factory in Stellarton, Nova Scotia, the facility built with millions of government dollars to mass-produce wooden consoles and fatally flawed color televisions, was eventually repurposed. It became a generic industrial building, a silent, sprawling concrete footprint in Pictou County. It no longer produces the rich, warm sound of Oscar Peterson or the hum of an assembly line building the future. It stands as a quiet, heavy monument to a catastrophic collision between political hubris and the harsh realities of industrial manufacturing. There is a strange, unexpected footnote to this collapse. Peter Monk, the young engineer who was publicly and humiliatingly forced out of the audio empire he created, did not fade into obscurity. He left the consumer electronics industry entirely and eventually founded Barrick Gold. He went on to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful mining executives in global history. He conquered the international gold market, but the beautiful, resonant wooden stereo consoles of his youth remained the most culturally significant physical objects he ever built. The philosophical tragedy of Clairtone is that they were right about the sound, and they were right about the design, but they were fatally wrong about the system required to sustain it. They built a boutique, luxury audio product that demanded careful, slow, specialized Canadian craftsmanship. Then, trapped by their own rapid growth and seduced by the promise of unlimited government funding, they tried to force that delicate process into a massive, politically driven assembly line in a town that had absolutely no history of building high-end electronics. They were simultaneously destroyed by domestic manufacturing costs, political interference, and a ruthless technological shift that saw the Canadian listening room completely abandon the massive console stereo in favor of small, separate Japanese components. They solved the aesthetics of the living room, but they could not survive the brutal economics of the factory floor. Yet the failure of the corporate entity cannot erase the triumph of the physical object. For a few brief years, a small company in Ontario built the coolest, most desired stereo system on the planet, and they forced the rest of the world to listen. Somewhere in a high-end Toronto apartment, a beautifully restored Project G still sits gracefully on its brushed aluminum cantilever base, the Brazilian rosewood gleaming, the black spherical speakers rotated outward into the room, waiting for one more record to move the air. See you in the next one.